Now, before you start, Mr. Wallace,
Yes.
this is my last review session.
Oh, hey. Thank you for your help. Well, remember, we have our picnic, Garrett, on Monday.
Garrett, could you sign my baseball?
Now, does everybody have the advanced placement test on chapters 31 to 36? All right? Now, if you have that test, I am going to desperately look for the key to that test. Okay. This is that. Okay, here's 51 is D, 52 is C, 53 is E. So D, C, E.
Wait, does that count as bonus or?
Yes.
Okay.
That test is just like any other test. Right? So you would do the same thing you would do on any other test. So it's DCE. All right. Now, here's what I want to do. The other test we'll get to. I'm going to scale that. Somebody got 47 out of 47. Several people got over 40. But I think that what we'll do is, I'm looking at right now making 40 the highest A. And then maybe going down by 5s. You know, 35 the lowest B, you know, and so on. So right now I'm kind of tending to make 40 the highest A, or the lowest A, and anything above 40 to be an A, and then a B range, and I'll give you percentages on that, a C range, and I'll give you percentages on that. Now, before we go over the 31 to 36, the mean on that AP was 74%. Now, that's not terrible. I mean, there weren't a lot of super high numbers. You know, not too many people got a 90%. But a 74 is not terrible. In the past, they had data to tell you, like, what percentage chance you would have had to have a 5 on the test if you would have got it. But I can say this. I think if you got 35 or above, that's pretty good. You know, I'm not sure, though. I'm not as confident as I was in the past. But I think 35 and above is pretty decent. Now, if you got below 35, I'm not sure it's tragic either. So we'll see. We'll see. Let's go over the regular test first, the one on chapters 31 through 36. And as I said, 62 people took the test. I have results for 62 people. Mean is 74% on that test. That's pretty good too. Last year the mean was 69% on that test. So this is up 5 points from last year. Now go to number 18. This is the test on chapters 31 through 36. Okay. Number 18, Roosevelt's chief administrator of relief, one of his closest advisors was Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins was in charge of the Emergency Federal Relief Agency. Harry Hopkins was eventually in charge of the WPA. Most of those were relief agencies that were intended to provide people with money either through work or direct payments to meet their basic needs. Of the first 25, that's the only one more than 50% of the students missed. But when we go to question 43, we have a whopping 43 students that missed that. So no, I'm sorry, 76 students missed 43. 76%. Spending enormous sums on the original atomic bomb project was spurred by the belief a nuclear weapon was the only way to win the war. B is the correct answer. The Germans might acquire such a weapon first. Is that what you had? Is that the right answer on your paper? Yes. I mean, the Germans were, when Einstein came to the United States and told Roosevelt that the Germans were working on such a weapon, Roosevelt is going to secretly petition Congress for funding to fund what's called the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project is the project that develops the nuclear bomb that is first detonated in the desert of Los Alamos, July 16, 1945. Robert Oppenheimer is going to head up that project. Einstein is kind of like the brains behind it, the conceptual brains behind it. Oppenheimer is the, the practical, actually delivering the project. Yes? E? Well, the reason, and I understand that, but the reason that, that's not true is because the decision to fund it was early, like 1941. So before the idea of even unconditional surrender was developed. So, I think that would be true if you said the reason that they detonated the bomb was that, but not the reason they funded it in the first place. Yes?
Should I notify for machine errors on the page?
Just fix it, in the interest of time. All right, so, now, 44 also was one that 65% of the students missed. Yeah, I understand why. Some of you put E. But the correct answer is low energy cost, A. That was one of the things that we listed, right? We listed low energy cost as one of the things that fueled the boom. Okay, 45. And that was another one that 56% of the students missed. In early 1945, the United States was extremely eager to secure the Soviet Union's participation in a projected invasion of Japan, right? Because the Soviets would become so engaged in East Asia, they would not expand further into Central Europe. Without Soviet help, the Japanese could not be defeated. C is the correct answer. American casualties were expected to be high if only Americans were involved. Is C the right answer? Yes. I mean, that's why we wanted them to help. If it was just us in this invasion, we expected that to be high casualties. If they were going to distract Japanese attention, that would be helpful. So that is the correct response. Other than that, well, 50 also. The United States participation in NATO reaffirmed America's long-standing commitment. No, that's not true. Marked a dramatic departure from traditional. Isn't B right? Yeah, B is right. It's a dramatic departure. So, reduce the need for no. So, yeah, B is the correct response. I mean, our participation in NATO is the first entangling alliance that we get into with Europeans on a permanent basis. I mean, World War I somewhat, Okay. Does anybody have any other questions on any of the items there? If not, please go to the other test now. The other test. And I don't know how you found this test, if you found it to be difficult. 53% of you missed the first question. That's not a good sign. 53%. So let's look at that. So you have this first excerpt, and it's from George Whitefield. And what do we associate Whitefield with? Right off the bat, what do we associate Whitefield with? Say it again. Say it. We associate him with George Whitefield. The Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, right? So we associate George Whitefield with the First Great Awakening. Who else do we associate with the First Great Awakening besides George Whitefield? Yes. John Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, we associate him with the First Great Awakening. We associate Whitefield with the First Great Awakening. Whitefield's evangelical tour across the colonies was, the first colonial-wide event in American history. And people are going to come from all over to listen to him preach. And it's interesting here that Benjamin Franklin is commenting on Whitefield. Why is it interesting that Benjamin Franklin is commenting on Whitefield? Yes?
Yeah, he probably looked to it as a reason for the revolution.
No. I'm thinking from a religious standpoint, Franklin was a deist. And so Franklin had very little kind of spirituality necessarily. But if you note in this reading, Franklin is going to talk about sort of the practical advantage of religion, right? But he's a friend of Whitefield, and he supports his evangelical movements, and he's writing here in his autobiography. So the first question is, Whitefield's impact suggests that religious culture in British North American colonies in the 1700s was most directly shaped by. So when we say shaped by, what are we talking about? Well, certainly it's not Roman Catholic influences. There were very few Roman Catholics. interest in commercial and business, right? Now, I understand it's kind of hard, but if you think about it, Whitfield came from Ireland, right? So coming from England, the only thing, is C the right answer?
Yeah.
The only thing that's possible is transatlantic exchanges, right? That's kind of like the only thing that's a possible answer there. Reliance on agriculture. I mean, where would you get that from? You know, I mean, in that excerpt. The only thing you could say is, well, Whitfield came from Ireland, and so religions come from England to here, right? So the transatlantic exchanges is the correct answer. And I recognize that's pretty difficult. Okay. Now, any other part of that question, does anybody, look at these, does anybody have a question on any other part of that question? Any other thing in that question? Go ahead, Darius.
Wouldn't number 1 kind of also fit into this? Because most of the people,
No, not at all.
I mean, D. I mean, choice D for number 1.
No, I mean, because that's just not part of it. It might be true, but it's just not part of it. Okay. Anything else about Whitfield, the Great Awakening, etc.? All right, go to the next, go to the chart. Now, in terms of the chart, 4 through 7, the most anybody, 6 was 33% of the people missed. So you did pretty well on the chart. Does anybody have it? What's that? What was happening in 45? What's that chart about? Yeah, go ahead, Joel.
Industrialization.
It's about industrialization, but what immigrants are coming in that time? Yes.
Irish and German.
The Irish and German immigrants are coming to work in the factories. And now remember, Darius, everybody look at me, all the people are looking at me. Now remember, anytime you have a demographic movement, demographics means the movement of people. Anytime you have a demographic movement, you have a push and a pull or both, right? A push or a pull or both. So what was pushing the Irish off the land? The potato famine and other things that were happening in Europe. What was pulling them into the United States? Well, you know, the opportunity to come into a free society is part of it, but also kind of the opportunity to work in, you know, factories, etc., that were now burgeoning because of the Industrial Revolution taking hold here. So that's what's happening, right? Now you see that big spike around 45, and then it culminates around 54, it begins to decline. So you answered questions about that, but that is the largest percentage immigration in American history as a percent of the population. Now, with the other two big migrations that we talked about the first and second wave of immigrants in the aftermath of the Civil War. So we have the Irish and Germans coming before the Civil War. People keep coming during the Civil War. After the Civil War, there are two waves. What was the difference between those two waves? First and second wave, old and new wave of immigrants after the Civil War. It's off of this question. Go ahead.
The difference is that most of the new wave immigrants came from Eastern Europe.
Yes, the new wave immigrants, that's Anika, that's 1890 really up until World War I, are mostly Southern and Eastern Europeans. Impoverished people, Catholics, Jews, etc., who migrate to large cities and generally stay there. They are wage laborers. They are the people that are going to constitute this big urban influx, which was a part of industrialization. The first wave were still Northern and Western Europeans, British, Irish, Germans, etc. Okay. All right, let's go to the... Does anybody have any questions about that question? Anybody? Yes, go ahead, Nate.
What are they usually settled?
Cities. New York, Philadelphia.
So, like northeast, not southeast?
Northeast, not south. No, very few immigrants in the south. Very few immigrants in the south. No industry there. It's agriculture. Right? All right. Go to 8. Now, when we get to question 8, remarkably, despite the fact we never talked about the Seneca Falls Convention or declarations of sentiments and resolutions, did you get my email?
Yeah.
Did you read about that? And that seemed to be enough to respond to the question. That's about women's rights. Now, in terms of women's rights, I think the first assertion of kind of feminism and women's rights is in that period of reform, that first reform movement. You know, that first reform period, and that's the 1820s, 1830s. right? So that first kind of flowering of reform is going to be a response to a number of things. The Second Great Awakening, you know, transcendentalism, changes in society are going to kind of, you know, promote that reform. The women's movement is just something we simply didn't talk about. One thing that I want to make a point about on 10, the women's movement and abolition during this time period was connected in some cases. So in some cases, abolitionism and women's rights and suffrage were similar movements or connected movements. When the abolitionists had, yes?
Could an argument be made for A?
Oh no. No. Social Darwinism can't even possibly, there's no Darwinism yet, right? There's no Darwin until a year after that, right? You know, so, yeah, isn't Darwin 1849? So, social Darwinism is far in the future. Now, back to the women's movement. It's connected to abolition in many people's mind. Garrison supported women's rights and abolition. But when it came down to pushing for the 15th Amendment and actually moving to abolition, some of the abolitionists don't want to muddy the water. The 15th Amendment in particular gives blacks the rights to vote. Why doesn't it give women the right to vote too? Well, the abolitionists are afraid if you threw women into the mix, it would muddy the water and neither would get any. So they part company over the 15th Amendment. And it says here, many supporters of the Declaration in 48 broke ranks with which of the following groups by the 1870s? Well, it was supporters of the 15th, is C the right answer? Yeah, supporters of the 15th Amendment, right? Okay. Oh, I see your argument for social Darwinism now. I mean, obviously. I mean, but yeah, I don't think they were ever in rap with it, to break with it. Okay, let's go to the next one, 11 through 13. Here you've got Payne and Jefferson. You do pretty well on that. Any questions about that question? Yes. 13. Everybody looking at me. Principles expressed by Payne and Jefferson best account for which of the following features of the United States during and immediately after the Revolution? Development of factions and political parties, definitely not. Rapid expansion of frontier settlements. No, I would say this. In both of those excerpts, you are talking about a role of government and it being fairly limited. I assume the door is locked there, yes. And it being fairly limited, right? So if you think about that, and that's kind of a tricky question. The relatively limited powers of the Articles of Confederation would in fact reflect that, because you're talking about limited powers. Okay. Let's see. This is the powers of number. That's another test there. And then you can take these. Nuts. Okay.
I just looked at it from the perspective
I can't. What did you say?
I looked at it from the perspective of people like Thomas Paine was obviously for like middle class people were able to retire.
Okay. So let's look at 13 again. Let's read it carefully. The principles expressed by Paine and Jefferson best account for which of the following things. So the principles that they put forward accounts for what? Right? So you know, what resulted from them is kind of what it's saying. The only thing that, I mean, those other things just don't make sense, right? You know, I mean, maybe D to a limited extent may make sense, but clearly when you're talking about limited government, C is what makes sense.
That's the secretary. That's the secretary of the test.
Yes.
How is,
That's the secretary of the
can't you say like 12 is also A?
I can't hear you.
For 12, did you say that was A? Because I know that's not right.
Oh, no. A?
Yeah, for 12.
A says the concept of hereditary rights and privileges. Oh, I see what you're saying now. But hereditary rights are like, you're like the Duke, or the Duchess, and you're privileged because of that.
I was thinking about like.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about 12 to 13? Okay. All right. 14 to 17. Now, everybody look at me. Right? 14 to 17. Now, in 14 to 17, we do pretty well again. Now, I want to stress this. This Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, is the case that reverses Plessy versus Ferguson. So Plessy versus Ferguson, if there's a question on the test about Plessy versus Ferguson and we get it wrong, I'm retiring at the end. I mean, we must have talked about Plessy versus Ferguson 15 times, right? That's 1896. That's the case that constitutionalizes the Jim Crow laws of the post-Civil War period, right? So Plessy versus Ferguson, constitutionalizes Jim Crow and segregation. What turns back those laws is Brown versus the Board of Education. It basically says that separate is inherently unequal. Now, let me ask you a question. Where are you guys? Where were you? Where were you guys at?
You're an SGA. Wow. Good for you. Good for you.
All right. Okay. All right. So. All right. So Brown versus the Board of Education basically says that separate is inherently unequal, right? So, the Jim Crow laws of the South, particularly those dealing with education, became unconstitutional. And so now what's going to transpire is kind of complying with the court's decision. So the court declares separate schools in Topeka, Kansas to be unconstitutional, and orders that all the segregated schools be desegregated with deliberate speed. Now, so what you have then in the South is desegregation in schools and other public facilities. Now, eventually that's going to become the modern civil rights movement. Martin Luther King is going to emerge as a leader of that segregation. Starting with the Montgomery bus boycott. And so there are questions regarding that there, and you did pretty well with them. And you noticed the one there. Okay. Anybody have any questions about any of those items? Anybody have any questions about Brown versus the Board of Education? Okay, let's go to 18 to 20. 18 to 20 is about the Immigration Acts, the Immigration Restriction Acts in 1924. It's a secondary source. And remember, we painted those Immigration Acts in the 1920s, those Immigration Restriction Acts, as kind of a reflection of the cultural conflict, fear by old America that we're being overwhelmed by foreigners coming into the United States, and so everybody look at me. So that's the context for those questions. Now the first one, 18, kind of says, who does this focus on? Those Immigration Acts were focused against Eastern and Southern Europeans. Anybody have any questions about that question? Okay, let's go to, yes. So the Immigration Act of 19 most directly reflected means showed, cultural tensions between scientific and modern religious beliefs, arising conflicts from migration of Africa, no, definitely not that, emergence of increasing national, no. That is a tough one. Is it?
Yeah, I thought it was African Americans.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. A is my guess. Is that right, or is it D? D. Social tensions emerging from. I kind of want to put I see why A is not correct when you put scientific modernism. So that's basically the Stopes trial. So then social tensions emerging from the First World War. I can see A. I can't see B. Not at all. Right? Because it's just not about African Americans in that sense. It's about ethnic, about foreign immigration. Okay. 21 to 23. You have the Truman Doctrine, we read that, everybody's looking at me, Truman Doctrine. And then you have Reagan's Brandenburg Gate speech there. And, you know, Ronald Reagan's presidency is important. I mean, if I was going to review something tonight, I mean, I would take a peek at that maybe, in prior for the test. And it's important in that the one thing that we stressed in numerous review sessions was that Reagan's kind of inaugural address reflects kind of this backlash against the expansion of government, right? That starts with populism, progressivism, the New Deal, Johnson's Great Society, and Reagan comes along and says government is not the solution, it's the problem, right? That's one thing. The other thing that's going to be true of Reagan is that he is going to be a vigorous Cold Warrior. He's going to want to build up America's military to battle the Soviets in kind of a conflict, that involves sort of arms. He's really not wanting to back down to the Soviets. He's a vigorous Cold Warrior. And, here he's kind of challenging the Soviets and challenging Gorbachev, who was seen as a Renaissance kind of Russian leader, to kind of end this Cold War conflict and the repression, tear down this wall, becomes a very famous line that Reagan is going to express. Okay, any questions about that? Any question? Good, Darius.
For number 21, could we argue D?
Statements of both, well, no.
I mean, because...
No, because it says statements of both Truman and Reagan share the same goal. I'm not sure that the goal was to avoid a military confrontation. I mean, I think that A is a more reasonable response. Is that right?
Yeah, I was stuck between A and B.
Yeah, I think A is a more... I mean, because we know Truman is about containment. Yes.
For 23, why is it
Why is it?
Well, you kind of had to know what happened before, right? So Reagan does escalate the rhetoric against the Soviet Union. That's what that's saying. He does escalate. He calls them the evil empire. He kind of escalates the arms race. He does up the ante, to some extent. So without kind of knowing that, it would be difficult to know that would be true. But it is true. I mean, that's one thing that we can stress, that Reagan is going to do that. He's going to represent kind of a harder line against the Soviets. Okay, then you have the picture, and that's a Jacob Riis picture. Jacob Riis is that journalist that writes How the Other Half Lives. You see the conditions there. That's the context of progressivism, right? And that's 24 through 26. Right? Any questions on that picture? 24 to 26. Now, one thing I think you can be sure of is that what you're seeing on these questions is what you'll see tomorrow. You're going to see graphs and charts, you're going to see pictures, you'll probably see cartoons, but you aren't going to, most of what you see is going to be text. Some of the text is primary, some of the text is secondary. Now, I would say that in some cases when I look at these questions, I mean, it does, some of the responses are ridiculous. They're out of context, they're out of the time frame, but it does get down sometimes to sort of two, and go with the one that you think is most right? I mean, very, very infrequently do you look at responses and think they're equally right. You sometimes think, well, it could be this one, right? But what you should do is say, I think it's this one, but it could be this one. Go with the one that you think it is, right? I mean, there can be elements of things that you think are correct, but I would go with the one that you think is correct. Now, in terms of like changing them, I wouldn't go back and change them unless I had a reason to. That's the rule of thumb in objective tests. You never change a response unless you have a reason to do so. Now you might say, what's a reasonable reason? A reasonable reason is that you go through the test and something dawns on you, you read something in another question that sparks your memory, or something comes along that just overwhelmingly makes you think that, yes, that was a mistake back there, I'm going to change it. Now, some of you took forever to complete this test. You only have 55 minutes and 55 questions. If you do not know an answer, have no idea, or don't skip it. There is no penalty for guessing. So what I would make sure that I would do on the multiple choice, which is 40% of your grade on the AP test, right? What I would make sure is that you at least answer every single question. So you don't want to be, when them, without having them say, well, you have 5 minutes left, you don't want to be on question 24. You want to be going back and trying to answer the ones that you left blank. Now, if you didn't have any problem finishing, I wouldn't worry about it, right? Because actually the 47 in the time period that you had today is less per question time than you'll have tomorrow, right? So today, in order to have the same time, you would have had to have 47 minutes for the second test, no first test, right? So for most of you, anybody that completed it in the time frame, the class time frame, you're not going to have any trouble at all, right? You should be fine. If you even went maybe 10 minutes after, you shouldn't have any trouble at all. If you do kind of go slow, make sure you get through the whole thing. Because you might get questions, 55 right and miss question 2. So you want to get through the whole thing, and there's no penalty for guessing. So you can just guess away when it gets close to the very end, with it. And if you are going to guess, like I said, if you're thinking, it's this one, but it could be this one, go with the one that you think is most right. All right. Now, okay, 27 to 29, John Muir. John Muir we associate with Theodore Roosevelt and environmentalism. Gifford Pinchot was the conservationist. John Muir is the environmentalist. He is the one, the preservationist, that wants to preserve the natural environment for its own sake. Right? That's a part of the progressive movement. That's an advocacy of Theodore Roosevelt for conservationism. That's the context. You can see 1909 is when that is expressed there. So, does anybody have any questions about that? He's talking about Yosemite, there, and, the nature of environmentalism. 27. Well, you guys did really well on that. The most anybody missed was 8%, or 10%, so that's pretty good. All right. Okay. Washington's farewell address. That's 30 through 32. I can admit 32, that's a question that I had too. Is the right answer, what is the right answer? Is it A? Oh, here's why I'd say. That's a tough one. Which of the following groups most strongly opposed Washington's point of view of the address? Well, he attacks the Democratic Republicans to some extent in the address, and they wanted to support France, right? So they wanted to adhere to the alliance, that the United States had. That's a really tough question, and I think you might be inclined to put Federalist there, but you wouldn't put Federalist because Washington was a Federalist, right? So A, that's a really tough one, but A is the correct response. But, really only 32, only 58% of you missed it, so you guessed, effectively. Any other questions about that? Remember, Washington's farewell address is a pillar of U.S. foreign policy, as is the Monroe Doctrine, as is the open door in China. Those are the three big pillars. The Monroe Doctrine is 1820, 23, 24, yes.
Which president initiated the open door policy? McKinley.
Mm-hmm. McKinley is the open door. All right. 34 to 36. Anybody have any questions about 34 to 36? 34 says the export of New World crops to the Old World transformed European society mostly by is A right? A's right, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, yes, the potato ruined everything in Europe. I mean, it improved their diet, the caloric intake, stimulated population growth. That's where the immigration comes from eventually, right? Any other questions about that? Oh, pardon me? Any other questions? All right, then you have the map there. Any questions about the map? That's questions 37, 38, 39. Okay. Then you got questions 40 through 42. Kids did pretty well on it. This is something I would remember though. Everybody look at me. I would remember this one because the justification in support of slavery always pops up on the test. How did the South eventually kind of support, slavery? And one of the ways that they do when they eventually come to support it is by saying that it's Christian. Christians support slavery, it's in the Bible, it's good for everybody, the slaves are good, the Southerners are enlightened, it's good for everybody. And John C. Calhoun is the center of that. What else did Calhoun do? What was the name? What else did he advocate? What notion? Calhoun? Yes. Nullification. Right? Where did nullification come from? What set of resolutions? The Virginia and Kentucky Resolution, 1798, was Jefferson and Madison. Right? Okay. And then lastly, John Smith, the description of New England in 1616. Any questions about that? Yes. 42
I
is...
can see how the A's be, because that actually happens. I was thinking like, how would people pushing west from that point?
Oh, maybe, but that's what... Certainly that's what happened.
Because I know also the Mexican-American War was going on at the same time.
Yeah, well, not yet. Not till 46. All right. If there are no other questions about the test, let me just tell you this before you go. So tomorrow when you come, right, you're to be there at 8. You have your passes. You need to bring a pen and a pencil, because your essays have to be in pen. Now, the test is in 2 parts. Part 1 is these multiple choice questions, right, and the short answers. The short answers you've got to confine to that paper. Now, I read some of your short answers today, your ones that you did for extra credit. They're pretty good, mostly, right? Now, 3 of the 4 of them, you're going to have something. A picture, a cartoon. 1 is just going to ask you a question. That's the dangerous one. If you don't know, now write something. On any essay, write something. Write anything, right? Because they're grading them holistically. They're grading them by points. You might stumble into a point. After that, you'll have a break, right? After your break, you'll come back and you'll have 2 essays, the DBQ and the free response. You have a total of an hour and a half for both of them, right? For both of those essays. So you have to make sure that you get ink on the paper for both of them. If you can, I would do the one you feel most comfortable with first. In all likelihood, that's the one you're going to score best on anyways. So if you feel like, well, I know this free response, and you can work on that first, but I don't know the DBQ, do the free response first and then do the DBQ. You feel like you can do the DBQ? I don't know if you can do that or not, but if you can, do it. Yes?
Is the free response worth more?
No, the DBQ is worth more. The free response essay is only worth 15% of your grade. 60% of the grade is that first part, right? Which we should be able to do pretty well on. 25% of the grade is the DBQ. 15% is that free response. Nobody leaves the AP history test thinking they did well, right? Nobody. Everybody comes out shaking their heads. So do not be discouraged if you come out shaking your heads. Yes?
So we get 2 questions to choose from for the first one.
Yes.
And do we have multiple choice from?
No, just one. But you have the documents. And you have to use every document but one. Yeah, they want you to. But they're pretty easy, yes.
How long is
The test is going to, I don't know, how much did I tell
I
you?
think it's like 3 hours.
3-hour test, so about 11 o'clock you should be done.
Oh,
Well, you'll have to miss it. All right, bring your papers back, bring your test back. I don't know what's what here. Does anybody know what's what here?
Oh, that would have helped so much.
That stinks.
What does?
I gotta eat lunch here, man. I'm missing my friends.
Over there. That's what
Sounds like everybody else.
just where you
No
got.
one's here that I know.
Here, give me the actual test.